Okay, so picture a scenario that I think is going to send an absolute shiver down the spine of every single security professional listening right now. It is 4:45 p.m. on a Friday.
Oh, man. It is literally always Friday afternoon.
Right. Naturally, that is when the phone rings. It is never, Tuesday morning at 10 a.m.
No, it's the universal law incident response.
Hmm.
If it is quiet on a Tuesday, you are just waiting for the Friday storm.
Exactly. So you pick up, and it is the general counsel. And
Whoa.
they are completely frantic. They have just been hit with a massive discovery order for a breach that happened 2 entire years ago.
Oh, wow. 2 years.
Yeah. And they need every single communication regarding that incident. Now, here's the catch. The conversation happened on Slack. The files they were sharing, those were dynamic links in OneDrive.
Let me guess, the users involved have left the company?
18 months ago, they are long gone. And just to put the absolute cherry on top of this disaster sundae, the data is hosted in a sovereign EU cloud instance, but the subpoena is coming from the U.S. government.
Yep. That is the perfect storm. You have just hit on basically every single pain point we are seeing in the industry right now. You have the technical nightmare of modern collaboration tools, the ephemeral nature of cloud data, and the absolute geopolitical mess of jurisdictional law all wrapped into one Friday afternoon phone call.
And that is exactly what we were digging into today because we often think of cloud security in terms of keeping bad guys out, right? We talk about firewalls, identity management, and zero trust. But what happens when you have to reach into the cloud and pull evidence out?
Right.
It turns out it is no longer as simple as walking into a server room and pulling a hard drive.
Not even close. The entire architecture of the cloud has fundamentally broken the traditional models of digital forensics. We are dealing with ephemeral data that vanishes in the blink of an eye. We're dealing with multi-tenancy, where your data is mixed with everyone else's, and these jurisdictional nightmares where borders essentially just, well, they don't exist anymore.
This is going to be so good. Welcome to InfoSec Bytes, your go-to deep dive for bite-sized insights on information security, AI, cloud, quantum, and cybersecurity incident root cause analysis. With over 100 deep dives, we've got you covered on the latest trends and tips. This year, we will focus more on cloud computing along with other topics, so stay tuned. Please like, subscribe, and share to join the conversation on various platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Amazon Music, and stay secure.
Today's going to be a fascinating one. We are conducting a really deep dive into the collision of cloud eDiscovery, the U.S. Cloud Act, and the technical nightmare of modern collaboration tools. We've got some incredible research to unpack.
Let's jump right into the deep end here. I want to start with the legal landscape because the research we have been looking at paints a pretty complex picture for you out there building these environments. There is this assumption, and I hear it from cloud architects all the time, that if they just select Frankfurt or Paris from a drop-down menu in AWS or Azure, their data is somehow magically safe from U.S. subpoenas because it is in Europe, so it's protected by European law.
Yeah, that is probably the single most dangerous misconception in cloud computing today.
Mm-hmm.
It is a comfort blanket that does not actually cover you. To really understand why that is wrong, we have to look at the history. We have to go back to the Microsoft Ireland case.
Right, because this was the precursor to the current laws, and this wasn't just some minor dispute. This went all the way up the chain.
It did. It was massive. So back around 2013, U.S. prosecutors wanted emails related to a drug trafficking investigation. These emails belonged to a suspect, and they were stored on a Microsoft server physically located in Dublin, Ireland. So the U.S. serves a warrant. Microsoft refused to hand them over. Their argument was very traditional. It was based on physical property law, which is basically that a U.S. warrant stops at the U.S. border.
Which makes intuitive sense to most people. I mean, if the police want to search a house in Dublin, they need an Irish warrant. They can't use a New York warrant to kick down a door in Ireland. So Microsoft argued digital data stored on a physical disk should be treated the exact same way.
Exactly. And initially, the appeals court actually agreed with Microsoft. They said, effectively, you cannot execute a warrant extraterritorially. But that victory was really short-lived because it completely panicked the U.S. government.
Because it created a loophole.
A massive loophole. They realized that criminals could essentially jurisdiction shop. They could live in New York, commit crimes in New York, but store their data on a server in a country that wouldn't cooperate with the U.S., effectively hiding evidence forever.
So the law had to catch up to the technology, which brings us to 2018.
Right. Congress passed the Cloud Act in 2018.
The Clarifying Lawful Overseas Use of Data Act.
That is the one. And it fundamentally shifted the legal standard. It moved away from the location of the data being the deciding factor to the control of the data.
So what does that actually mean for you as an architect? Control sounds like a pretty vague term. Is it ownership? Is it having an admin account?
It is actually quite specific in legal terms. The Cloud Act says that if a U.S.-based provider or even a subsidiary of a U.S. provider has possession, custody, or control of the data, the U.S. government can compel them to produce it. It absolutely does not matter where the server physically sits. It could be in Frankfurt. It could be on the moon.
Wow.
Yeah. If the company is a U.S. entity and they have the technical ability to access that data, they must hand it over.
Let me just throw in a quick note here to clarify possession, custody, or control for everyone listening. Because in this context, it doesn't just mean do you own the hard drive. It means do you have the administrative ability to decrypt or access that data? If an admin sitting in Seattle can literally type a command to view data sitting in a data center in Frankfurt, they have control.
Precisely. If the capability exists, the obligation exists. And this creates a massive conflict for European companies, or really any U.S. company operating in Europe. Because on one side, you have the Cloud Act saying, give us the data. And on the other side, you have the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, specifically Article 48.
Right. I wanted to ask about that. Because GDPR is famously strict, doesn't it essentially forbid this kind of overseas transfer?
It does. Article 48 represents what we call the compliance bind. It clearly states that a court order from a third country, like the U.S., is not valid grounds to transfer data out of the EU unless there is an international treaty in place, something like an MLAT, which stands for Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty.
So let's play this scenario out for the listener. A U.S. judge issues a warrant to a hyperscaler for data sitting in Germany. The hyperscaler looks at the warrant. If they hand over the data, they are violating GDPR, and they face those massive fines from the EU. What is it, up to 4% of global turnover?
Yep, up to 4%, which is billions for these companies.
Right. But if they refuse the warrant, they are in contempt of court in the U.S.
Exactly. They are completely caught between a rock and a hard place. And this is where the marketing of sovereign cloud becomes very, very tricky. You see these major U.S. hyperscalers marketing EU data boundaries or sovereign clouds. They sell this idea that your data never leaves Europe.
Which sounds great on paper.
It sounds perfect. And technically, the bits might not leave Europe during normal day-to-day operations. But the research indicates that as long as the parent company is U.S.-based, the Cloud Act still applies, period.
I recall reading in the research about a specific admission regarding this. It was surprisingly blunt.
Yes, this was quite a moment in the industry. A chief legal officer for Microsoft in France actually admitted under oath before the French Senate that the company could not guarantee EU data was safe from U.S. access requests due to the Cloud Act.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a moment of rare transparency that really highlighted the massive gap between marketing brochures and legal reality.
That is incredibly candid. So if MLATs are the official way to do this government to government, why aren't they used all the time? Why do we even need the Cloud Act if we have treaties?
Because MLATs are incredibly slow. An MLAT request is like sending a diplomatic pouch via steamship. It involves the U.S. Department of Justice sending a request to the State Department. Then the State Department sends it to the Foreign Ministry of the other country, who then sends it to their local court.
That sounds like a bureaucratic nightmare.
It can take months, sometimes years. In a fast-moving cyber investigation or a terrorism case, investigators simply do not have months. That is why the Cloud Act introduced executive agreements.
Oh, these are the fast lanes the research talks about.
Correct. These are bilateral agreements that entirely bypass the traditional MLAT process. Currently, the U.S. has agreements in force with the U.K. and Australia.
So think of it like this for those listening. An MLAT is like the police coming to your house, realizing you aren't home, and having to go back to the courthouse to get permission, then finding a locksmith. An executive agreement is like the police having a master key that is pre-sanctioned by the homeowners association. They don't need to ask permission every single time. They have a pre-agreed process to just enter.
That is a brilliant analogy, and for companies, this adds just another massive layer of complexity. If you are a UK company using a US cloud provider, there's now a streamlined, totally legal path for the US to get your data without going through the slow diplomatic channels. It essentially removes the blocking statutes that used to protect that data.
So the real takeaway here for our listeners who are navigating this architecture is that data residency is not data sovereignty. Just because the data lives on a spinning disk in Berlin does not mean it is under German law exclusively.
Absolutely correct. Sovereignty requires technical controls, not just geographic ones. We will get to mitigation later in the deep dive, but keep that distinction in mind. Control trumps location every single time.
Okay, let's pivot from the legal headache to the technical migraine. Let's talk about the actual architecture of cloud eDiscovery. When you move from an on-premise environment into the cloud, how does the actual physical collection of evidence change? Because back in the day, we did dead box forensics.
Right, dead box forensics is a very physical, tactile process. You walk into the office, you literally pull the power plug out of the wall to preserve the state of the drive and prevent any shutdown scripts or malware from wiping things. You bag the tower, you take it to a clean lab, and you create a bit-by-bit image of the hard drive using a write blocker. You owned the actual atoms of that drive.
And now, in the cloud era.
Now, Deadbox is completely dead. You cannot walk into an AWS data center in Virginia and ask the guard to let you pull a hard drive. First of all, your data is likely striped across dozens of physical drives shared with hundreds of other customers. Secondly, they have armed guards who simply won't let you in the door. So the collection method depends entirely on the service model. You have to look at IaaS versus SaaS.
Let's break those down for the audience. Infrastructure as a service at AWS. This is your EC2 instances in AWS, your Azure VMs. This feels the closest to the old world, right?
It does. With IaaS, it feels somewhat similar to traditional forensics, but with a major twist. You can still take snapshots like an AWS EBS snapshot or an Azure VHD file. This gives you a logical copy of the disk, but you lack physical access. You are entirely at the mercy of the hypervisor.
The hypervisor being the underlying software layer that runs the virtual machines. Why is that such a limitation for an investigator?
Because you cannot bypass the hypervisor to get to the raw physical disk sectors. In traditional on-prem forensics, we could sometimes recover deleted data from slack space or damaged sectors on the physical platter. In the cloud, if the hypervisor says a sector is zeroed out, it is zeroed out to you. You are collecting a logical representation of the drive, not the physical drive itself.
So if there's something nasty in there,
If there's malware hiding at the hypervisor level, which is rare but technically possible, you might miss it entirely because the hypervisor is lying to your snapshot tool.
but SaaS software as a service, that is where the research really suggests things get messy. We are talking Microsoft 365, Google Workspace, Salesforce, Slack. This is where most actual business communication happens today.
SaaS is an absolute black box. You have zero access to the back-end operating system. You cannot take a snapshot of the server running your corporate Slack instance because you don't own the server. Slack owns it. So you are entirely reliant on APIs.
Application programming interfaces.
Yes. When you collect data from SaaS for a lawsuit, you aren't really collecting it in the forensic sense we are used to. You are requesting it. You are sending a query to the provider's API saying, please give me all emails from user X between these two dates, and the API returns what it thinks you asked for.
That feels like a subtle but massive difference. You are essentially trusting the provider's API to be honest, complete, and bug-free.
It is a massive difference. You lose the chain of custody at the deepest level, and it brings up the massive risk of multi-tenancy. Your highly sensitive corporate data sits on the exact same physical hardware as thousands of other companies. In a traditional raid, if law enforcement seized a physical server, they seized that specific company's data. In the cloud, a broad warrant or a technical error in the API collection tool could theoretically expose neighbor data.
Commingling.
Exactly. Now, encryption usually mitigates this. Your data is typically encrypted with your key, hopefully, but the theoretical risk is always there. And then you have the hidden costs. eDiscovery involves moving massive amounts of data. In the cloud, putting data in is almost always free. Taking it out, that triggers egress fees.
The classic cloud trap. It is the Hotel California of data. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave without paying a massive bill.
We have seen cases in the research where legal teams ordered a massive dump everything collection, completely not realizing that moving 50 terabytes of data out of the cloud for a legal review platform would trigger thousands and thousands of dollars in egress charges.
Because it's, what, 9 cents a gigabyte sometimes?
Egress costs can run around 9 cents per gigabyte, yeah. If you were pulling 50 terabytes, you can do the math on that. That is a massive line item the CFO was absolutely not expecting on a random Tuesday.
And then there's throttling.
Oh, throttling is the silent killer of incident response. APIs have limits. They are designed for normal operational use, sending a message, reading a document, not for dumping the entire corporate database all at once. If you try to pull all of a company's emails instantly, the provider's API protection will kick in and just block you. It thinks you are a DDoS attack.
It throws a 429 too many requests error.
Exactly. So collections that used to take hours on a local gigabit network can now take days or even weeks because you have to sip the data through a tiny straw rather than drinking from a fire hose.
That is a crucial planning factor for anyone doing incident response. If the court gives you 48 hours to produce this data, but the API physically throttles you to a speed that takes 96 hours, you have a massive legal problem that technology cannot solve.
A very big problem. And honestly, that is just the plumbing. That is just getting the data out. The actual content of what you are collecting is where it gets really, really interesting.
This brings us perfectly to a specific pain point that kept popping up in all the research: modern attachments. Which, I have to say, sounds like a very slick marketing term, but it seems to be an absolute legal nightmare.
It is a total nightmare for compliance teams. Modern attachments is the industry term for sending a cloud link instead of a physical file.
Okay, let's unpack this for everyone. In the old days, say 2010, I send you an email with a contract attached. It is a PDF file. That file is physically encoded right into the email. It's an MIME attachment. It is a static blob of data. If I change the file on my local desktop 5 minutes later, the email attachment you received doesn't change. It is frozen in time.
Correct. The evidence is frozen. It is a perfect historical record. But now, in the world of OneDrive and Google Drive, I don't send you the file. I send you a hyperlink to the file sitting in my cloud storage.
So let's look at this scenario. Alice sends Bob a link to a contract on Monday morning. Bob opens it on Tuesday. But on Wednesday, Alice or maybe someone else on her team edits that live contract. Then on Friday, legal comes in and collects the email.
Here's the massive problem. The link in the email points to the current live version of the file. So when legal clicks that link on Friday, they see the Wednesday version. But the evidence requires knowing what Bob actually saw on Tuesday when he opened it. Did he agree to the Monday version or the Wednesday version? The email itself does not tell you.
That completely destroys the evidentiary value of the communication. You don't know what was actually communicated or agreed upon. It is like sending a letter where the ink just keeps changing after you put it in the mailbox.
It totally compromises the integrity of the communication. And the technical challenges just pile up from there. What if the link is broken? By the time discovery happens 2 years later, maybe Alice deleted the file to save space. Maybe she renamed it. Maybe she moved to a new department and revoked Bob's permissions. The link is completely dead.
Right.
You have email saying, hey, here's the contract we agreed on, but the contract itself is just gone. A 404 error.
And the courts are catching on to this, right? The research points out they aren't just accepting file not found anymore.
They are definitely catching on. Research suggests courts are fundamentally shifting the burden of proof. It used to be accepted that if you produced the email, you were generally good. Now courts are saying, no, you must produce the linked file exactly as it existed at the exact time of the message.
But how do you actually do that programmatically if the file has changed a dozen times since then?
That is what we call the version nightmare. To do this programmatically at scale, you need premium licensing. For example, in the Microsoft ecosystem, you typically need Purview E5 licensing to automate the capture of the version at the time of send.
So if you are running a cheaper license tier like E3, you might just be out of luck.
You very well might be. The only real solution is proactive retention policies. You must configure the cloud environment to version every single document change. If you do not turn on deep versioning before the litigation starts, that historical context is gone forever. You cannot use forensics to reconstruct a version that was literally never saved to the disk.
This feels like a recurring theme here today. You cannot fix this after the fact. If the configuration isn't right on day 1, you lose in court on day 100.
Absolutely. Retroactive security is not a thing in the cloud. And nowhere is that more obvious than in collaboration data. I'm talking about Slack and Teams.
Oh yes, the absolute wild west of corporate communications. I feel like everyone moved to Slack and Teams so fast during the pandemic that nobody stopped to ask, wait, how do we actually litigate this stuff?
That is exactly what happened. We moved overnight from structured static communication like email to this unstructured continuous stream of consciousness chat. And for forensics investigators, it is an absolute disaster.
Why is it so much harder than email? I mean, to a layman, text is text, right?
You would definitely think so. But let's look under the hood at Slack. Slack data is not a document. When you export it, it is a JSON file.
For the non-coders listening, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It is a very lightweight data interchange format. It is fantastic for computers to talk to each other. It looks like a huge nested block of brackets, quotes, and commas, but it's terrible for a human, let alone a jury, trying to read a conversation.
Exactly. If you export a Slack channel natively, you get this massive text file full of code. And critically, it separates the messages from the user profiles. So you might see a line of code that says, user ID U12345 said yes. You have to go parse an entirely different JSON file just to find out that U12345 is actually John Doe in accounting.
And the fragmentation of these conversations is a big issue too, according to the research.
Huge. A Slack conversation about a project might span days or weeks, but exports are often done in 24-hour slices to manage the sheer file size. So you get a JSON file for Monday, a separate file for Tuesday, and so on.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah. If I ask you a highly incriminating question at 11:59 p.m. on Monday, and you answered yes at 12:01 a.m. on Tuesday, those two pieces of the conversation are in two completely different files. If your forensic eDiscovery tool doesn't stitch them back together perfectly using thread IDs, I lose all the context.
Oh.
I just see you saying yes on Tuesday with absolutely no question attached to it.
That sounds incredibly dangerous for establishing context in a legal setting. A standalone yes could mean anything. It could mean, yes, I committed the fraud, or it could mean, yes, I want to order tacos for lunch.
And then there are the edits and the deletes. In email, once you hit send, it routes through the server. You generally can't take it back. In Slack, I can write, I authorize the fraudulent transfer, hit send, realize what I just did, panic, and edit the message to say I love puppies.
And unless you have the right settings enabled globally, that original message is just vaporized.
Precisely. Unless you have legal hold or enterprise grid features and able to explicitly capture the edit history of every message, the original text is simply overwritten in the database. It does not exist anymore, anywhere.
I also read something fascinating in the research about emojis being treated as evidence, which sounds kind of funny at first, but it is actually dead serious.
It is very serious.
Okay.
There was a recent Canadian court case where a simple thumbs-up emoji was ruled to be a valid legal acceptance of a contract.
A thumbs up emoji.
A literal thumbs-up emoji. So now, forensics tools have to capture the reaction array in the JSON, not just the text body. If I send you a contract in a direct message and you react with a thumbs up and my export tool only grabs the text, it looks to the court like you completely ignored me, but legally, you signed a binding deal.
That is wild. And what about private channels? Because that seems like a massive blind spot.
Oh, private channels are the absolute bane of eDiscovery. Standard native Slack exports often completely miss private channels unless you have the highest tier admin privileges, usually the enterprise grid level, or you actually have the individual user's consent and credentials. It creates a massive forensic blind spot.
So you could be collecting everything in general and random?
Exactly. While the actual corporate conspiracy is happening in a private channel called the real plan that your export tool doesn't even know exists.
And what about Microsoft Teams? Is it any better? Because it is Microsoft, you would assume it ties into their compliance center and is more structured.
Teams is. Well, Teams is different. The research describes it as a Frankenstein architecture.
Frankenstein. That is not a word you usually hear associated with enterprise SaaS software.
It really fits, though.
Mhm.
Teams is not one single storage location. It is essentially a user interface wrapper that glues together 3 or 4 entirely different Microsoft backend services.
Break that down for us. Where does the data actually live?
Okay, so when you chat in a standard Teams channel, that text is actually ingested and stored in Exchange, hidden in a special compliance mailbox structure.
Okay.
But when you share a file in that exact same channel, that file does not go to Exchange. It goes to a hidden SharePoint site. If you have a private one-on-one chat and share a file, that file goes to the sender's personal OneDrive. And if you leave a voicemail or record a meeting, that goes to Azure Media Services.
So wait, to collect one single continuous conversation for court, you have to query Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, and Azure.
Yes. You have to programmatically reassemble these disparate pieces from 4 different databases to show a court what actually happened.
Yeah.
If you only collect the Exchange data, you get the chat text, but none of the files they're talking about. If you just collect SharePoint, you get a bunch of isolated files with zero context of why they were shared. It's a massive puzzle that you have to solve every single time you do a collection.
This leads us directly into the legal concept of spoliation. We touched on it briefly with the Slack edits, but I want to dive much deeper here. Spoliation is the destruction of evidence.
Right. And usually when we hear spoliation, it implies malicious intent, like executives shredding physical documents while the auditors are literally waiting in the lobby, or taking a hammer to a hard drive in the server room. But in the cloud, spoliation is very often completely accidental and fully automated.
The robots are shredding the evidence for us.
Exactly. Many cloud systems have default automated retention policies to manage data lifecycles. For example, a system might be set to auto-delete Slack messages or Teams chats after 90 days to save on storage costs or reduce general liability. That is totally fine during normal business operations.
But when a lawsuit hits,
The moment litigation is reasonably anticipated, the exact moment that frantic Friday phone call happens, you have a strict legal duty to preserve that data. If you do not suspend that auto-delete policy immediately and the system automatically purges data on day 91, you are guilty of spoliation. The court does not care that it was an automated script.
it is like, here's an analogy for the listeners. It is like having an industrial document shredder on a timer in the office. It just shreds everything in the bin every single night at midnight. That is totally fine until a lawsuit starts. Then, if you forget to unplug the shredder and it shreds the evidence that night, the court doesn't care that the machine did it. You failed to stop the machine.
That is the perfect analogy. And the absolute biggest trap we see in the research is inactive accounts.
This is the scenario where an employee leaves the company.
Yes. Say you fire an employee for gross misconduct. He packs up and leaves. IT says, great, he is gone. Let's save $30 a month and delete his Microsoft 365 license.
Which is a very logical cost-saving move for IT to make. Why keep paying for a ghost?
It is a fatal mistake legally. Research shows that when you remove that license, Microsoft puts the data in a soft-deleted holding state for exactly 30 days. After 30 days, it is permanently purged, wiped from the back end.
But the lawsuit for wrongful termination or intellectual property theft might not actually be filed for 6 months.
Exactly. 6 months later, legal comes down and says, hey, we need all of his emails to defend this lawsuit. IT says, well, we deleted his license to save $180. And now the company is facing a $1 million court sanction for deletion of evidence.
That is a truly terrifying return on investment calculation. So what is the actual solution for you listening out there? Because you cannot reasonably keep paying premium licenses for every single employee who ever left the company over the last 10 years.
No, you can't. The industry best practice is called in-place preservation or litigation hold. Most enterprise-grade cloud platforms allow you to place a legal hold on a specific mailbox or user. This absolutely locks the data down. Even if you delete the user account or strip the license, the backend platform keeps a hidden, immutable copy of that data indefinitely for discovery purposes.
But you have to know to set that up.
You have to set it up proactively, and you often need the right compliance license tier to do it. But paying for that license is infinitely cheaper than a spoliation sanction. And critically, you should always use the cloud's native preservation tools. Do not try to manually copy all the data out to a local hard drive that is incredibly expensive, it breaks metadata, and it creates a static, stale copy. Lock it where it sits in the cloud. It looks like it has gone to the front-end user, but the cloud provider is keeping it totally safe in the shadowy backend.
Okay, we have covered the legal minefield of the Cloud Act, the architectural nightmare of APIs, the broken links of modern attachments, the fragmented JSON chat logs, and accidental automated shredding. This is a lot to process. Let's talk about solutions. What do we actually do? Specifically, looking back at Section 1 and those EU sovereignty issues.
Strategic mitigation is the key here. You simply cannot rely on defaults. The research points to a few very strong technical defenses that architects can employ.
Let's start with encryption because that always comes up.
The ultimate defense is BYO or HYOK.
Bring your own key or hold your own key.
Right. In a standard out-of-the-box cloud model, the provider holds the encryption keys. They encrypt your data at rest, yes, but they have the key to decrypt it. That means if they get a U.S. subpoena, they can comply, decrypt the data, and hand it over.
But if I hold my own key?
If you hold the master encryption key, preferably physically stored in a hardware security module, or HSM, located in your own physical data center in your own country, then the cloud provider is completely blind. If the U.S. government subpoenas Microsoft or AWS, the provider can only hand over a blob of encrypted gibberish. They can honestly say to the judge, we physically cannot decrypt this. We do not possess the key.
That shifts the legal subpoena target away from the cloud provider directly to you, the customer.
Correct, which is exactly what you want. It gives you the chance to fight the subpoena in your own local court using your own lawyers, rather than having the cloud provider secretly hand your data over behind your back under a gag order.
And what about client-side encryption? The research mentions that as well.
It is a similar concept. You encrypt the data locally on your laptop before it ever even hits the network to go to the cloud. To the cloud storage provider, your file is just random noise. This is highly effective for extremely sensitive intellectual property, but it comes with a major cost. It completely breaks a lot of native cloud functionality, like eDiscovery search, indexing, and co-authoring.
You can't search what the cloud can't read? The research also mentioned a growing shift toward European providers.
Yes, we're seeing a distinct move toward EU-native Cloud providers. These are companies that are founded in Europe, have no U.S. parent company, no U.S. subsidiaries, and absolutely no U.S. business footprint.
Why does that matter so much?
Because if they have no legal nexus to the United States whatsoever, the Cloud Act simply does not apply to them. A U.S. judge has no jurisdiction.
So using a local French or German cloud company instead of defaulting to AWS or Azure?
Exactly. It is currently the only way to be 100% legally sure the Cloud Act cannot touch your infrastructure. But of course, you often lose the massive global scale and the advanced feature sets of the American hyperscalers. It is a significant business trade-off.
And finally, how does Zero Trust fit into this?
Zero Trust architecture helps tremendously by limiting the provider's standing access. If the system administrators at the cloud provider do not have standing, persistent access to your data enclaves, it adds a massive layer of operational friction to any collection attempt. But remember, legally, if they own and control the underlying physical hardware, they can usually force access eventually if compelled by court.
One last warning that jumped out from the research was about shadow IT, and specifically apps like Signal, WhatsApp, Telegram.
Ah, yes. This is what we call the data dark matter. We know it is out there exerting gravity on the business, but we absolutely cannot see it. Executives love Signal because it is secure and encrypted. But for a corporation, if actual business decisions are happening on Signal and the messages are set to auto-disappear after an hour, you are essentially pre-spoliating corporate evidence.
If you can't capture it, you can't defend it in court.
Exactly. If the SEC or the Department of Justice asks for executive communications regarding a merger, and your general counsel has to say, well, they use Signal and it's all gone, regulators are increasingly taking a very, very dim view of that. They view that not as privacy, but as a fundamental failure of corporate compliance controls.
Okay, let's unpack this, or rather, let's wrap this up for today. We have covered a truly massive amount of ground in this deep dive.
We really have.
Yeah.
And if I had to summarize the absolute core key takeaway for everyone listening, it is this. Cloud eDiscovery is no longer just an IT problem. It is a critical convergence of legal strategy and deep technical architecture. You simply cannot rely on default configurations. The default settings in every major cloud platform are designed for user convenience and storage optimization. They are absolutely not designed for legal preservation.
And the simple delete button is way, way more complex than any of us think.
It is. In some cloud systems, delete just means hide from the user for 30 days. In other systems, delete means cryptographic wiping that is gone instantly. And sovereignty, as we discussed, is largely a legal fiction unless it's backed up by hard technical controls like holding your own encryption keys. If you do not hold the keys, you do not truly hold the data.
It really emphasizes that your legal department and your IT architects need to be best friends. Legal desperately needs to understand that collecting the Slack data isn't just pushing one magical button. And IT really needs to understand that saving a few bucks a month on user licenses can end up costing the company millions in federal court.
Absolutely. That crucial meet and confer between IT and legal needs to happen right now while the skies are clear. It cannot wait until that Friday afternoon panic call when the subpoena has already arrived.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me, just thinking about the future. We talked about all this human-generated data. What happens when we have AI agents autonomously negotiating vendor contracts with each other in a Slack channel? Who is the legal custodian of that data? Is it the AI?
Oh, that is absolutely the next frontier of this nightmare. If an AI agent hallucinates or makes a legally binding promise in a chat log, is the company bound by it? And how on earth do you depose a large language model in a deposition? We are rapidly moving into a world where the evidence itself might be entirely synthetic.
A massive topic for another deep dive for sure. Something for all of you to chew on this week.
Definitely. Keep your keys close and your retention policies closer.
Thanks for tuning in to InfoSec Bytes. Keep exploring our 100-plus deep dives on information security, AI, cloud, quantum, and cybersecurity incident root cause analysis. Please like, subscribe. We're on various platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Amazon Music, and share to stay connected and keep your cyber defenses strong. See you in the next deep dive. Stay tuned.